Good morning. We'll get started in about 30 seconds. Good morning and welcome to LACO's LCAP training. We want to thank you for joining us this morning. Today is day one of a two-part LCAP training this week. I am Adrienne Balcazar, and I would like to introduce the LCAP State and Federal Programs Unit. Today, joining us is Debbie Cano. Do you want to say hello, Debbie?
Hi, everybody.
Helen Choi.
Good morning, everyone.
Laurel Estrada.
Good morning.
Augustine Garcia.
Good morning. Happy Tuesday.
Rachel Garcia.
Good morning, everyone.
Jeannie Keith.
Good morning, everyone.
And Anita Lomeli.
Good morning, everyone.
I also want to introduce our staff, April Grease.
Good morning.
Great. Welcome. To access today's presentation, we ask you to click on the link in the chat. This will take you directly to the slides. If you use the link at the top of this slide, this will take you to our Canvas page. The presentation can also be accessed through the icon as shown here, as well as the agenda and any resources that we share. We ask you to place your questions in the chat box, and we will answer any simple questions if we can, but we will follow up with the written responses in a Q&A that will be emailed to you. We are also recording today's training and will post this recording on our website as well. Today's presentation is part one of our two-day training. The focus for day one is to go over how to approach your LCAP in year two of this three-year cycle. On Thursday, our day two will go over the metrics, local indicators, and the fiscal side of the LCAP. There's just so much to cover that we can't all do it in one day. So let's take a look at what we will cover today. We'll start by going over the LCAP introduction and overview for year two. Then our training this year is going to take a different approach. We will cover the sections of the 25-26 LCAP through the lens of continuous improvement in the second year of your three-year plan. We will cover the plan summary, engaging educational partners, the goals and actions, including the goal analysis, and the increased or improved services. However, we will be taking a different approach, and you'll notice as we focus on what do you do in reflecting in year one and how will that impact your LCAP in year two. So let's begin with an introduction and overview of the LCAP. The California Way aligns the LEA's fiscal and program through three main principles of accountability. Accountability through support and improvement, equity, and subsidiarity. In the 24-27 three-year LCAP cycle, the LCFF shifted from compliance-oriented accountability to an accountability system that focuses on outcomes and provides support for continuous improvement. The LCAP focuses on equity, where all are provided with an equal amount of base funding, but because equal funding alone is not equitable, additional funding is given to LEAs with high concentration of students from families with low income, students in the foster care system, and students learning the English language to provide additional support. The California Way also follows the principle of subsidiarity, and this is where the LCFF recognizes that educators know the needs of their students best, and that LEAs are best positioned to engage local educational partners to provide and improve student outcomes. As a result, the LCFF places the responsibility around improving student outcomes at the local level by allowing LEAs to determine how best to allocate resources. Accountability is maintained through transparency and engagement with all educational partners. So let's take a closer look at the LCFF funds. Within the California Way, the funds that are used in the LCAP are called LCFF funds. The LCFF funds are comprised of base funds, as mentioned before, which are based on the average daily attendance and vary based on grade span adjustments. Then there are supplemental grant funds, and these are additional LCFF funds provided to every LEA based on LEA's unduplicated pupil count. The supplemental grant funds are equal to 20% of the adjusted base grant multiplied by ADA and unduplicated pupil percentage. Then we have concentration grant funds, and these are additional LCFF funds provided to LEAs with an unduplicated pupil percentage over 55%. The concentration funds is equal to 65% of the adjusted base grant multiplied by ADA and unduplicated pupil percentage exceeding 55%. Then in 2021, in the Budget Act of 2021, LEAs were given LEAs that had an unduplicated pupil percentage over 55% were given funds now as part of the concentration grant funds, but these funds are used specifically to increase the number of staff at schools with over 55% unduplicated pupil percentage as compared to schools with an unduplicated pupil percentage equal to or below. Lastly, the unmet portion of the minimum proportionality percentage, the MPP, that an LEA has must now carry over into the coming LCAP year. So we saw that happening recently. And this is calculated through the LCAP action tables. The requirement for this funding is that LEAs must meet their minimum proportionality percentage, including the carryover. And LEAs must ensure that they are increasing or improving services for English learners, foster youth, and low-income students in proportion to the amount of supplemental and concentration dollars they are receiving. And LEAs can meet their MPP by increasing or improving services for their unduplicated students. Initially, the LCAP, next slide. Initially, the LCAP and its instructions were all that the LEAs had to follow. But as each year has passed, additional requirements have been added to the LCAP and the instructions. The additional requirements are the equity multiplier, where LEAs are required to document the efforts to improve outcomes for students at the identified school sites now in the LCAP. The requirements must be applied each year. So as each year, and we'll go in detail with this in day 2 on Thursday. Lowest performance level on 2023 California dashboard. The LEA must identify and address the needs of the student groups with the lowest performance level based on the 2023 dashboard. The LEA must maintain the identification and address the needs based on the 2023 California dashboard during the 3-year LCAP cycle. And new this year is the Learning Recovery Emergency Block Grant. You're going to hear a lot about that this year in this presentation today. The new requirement of including LREBG funds in the 25-26 LCAP is part of the Kayla J. lawsuit settlement, which requires that any unspent LREBG funds must be included in the LCAP. Senate Bill 153 added California Ed Code 52064.4, which requires revisions to be made to the instructions for this LCAP for this 25-26 school year. And it states that all unexpended LREBG funds must be included in the LCAP for the 25-26, the 26-27, and the 27-28 LCAP years. So this will be in year 2 and 3 of the current 3-year LCAP cycle and year 1 of the 27-28 to 29-30 LCAP cycle. Actions using LREBG funds must remain in the LCAP until the LEA has expended the remainder of its LREBG funds. And there's also a requirement for a needs assessment, and this can be found in Ed Code 32526D1. We've been getting a lot of questions about this particular question. So in the FAQ, CDE has posted this Q&A. And so it has, if an LEA has expended all of its LREBG funds by June 30th, must the LEA complete the new LREBG requirements in the 25-26 LCAP? So CDE has answered, if the LEA has expended all LREBG funds by June 30th, 2025, it does not need to complete the LREBG requirements in the 25-26 LCAP. However, if the LEA has any unspent LREBG funds as of July 1st, the LEA is required to include the unspent LREBG funds in their 25-26 LCAP and follow the applicable requirements. If the LEA does not initially include unspent funds in the 26 LCAP, but later identifies that they have unspent funds, then the LEA must go through the entire LCAP adoption process to add in the unspent funds for the LCAP to be approvable. We also want to make you aware of Ed Code 32526G, and this addresses additional LREBG funding in the 25-26 budget. The Ed Code states that it is the intent of the legislature to allocate $378,650,000 per year from the 25-26 fiscal year to the 27-28 fiscal year, inclusive to the department for transfer to the Learning Recovery Emergency Fund created pursuant to Section 32525. So if you have planned to expend all funds, but now this is in effect, how does that impact you? So we reached out to CDE, and CDE has informed us that this is under review. Administration will need to discuss with the legislature, and this is part of the budget process and the May revise. So at this point in time, CDE has asked everyone to be patient and wait to see how this develops. Once CDE knows that the additional LREBG funds are a sure thing and the governor signs this in law, they will be able to provide some guidance on how to address this, because the timeline for the apportionment will not align with the adoption of the LCAP for the 25-26 school year. So again, we want to just make you aware, but at the same time, we really don't have any answers yet. But again, rest assured, CDE will guide us and all of you, and we'll make sure that everyone is updated with the latest information. So this will be to be continued, but again, I just wanted to put that out for everyone. We also wanted to point out some other changes to the 25-26 LCAP template and instructions. So LTELS is now a student group that has been added to be reported as reported data as a subgroup of ELs. There is also a dashboard update, which includes this year the status only of science data. In the plan summary, LEAs may, but not must, provide information about their strategic plan, vision, etc. in the general information section. The annual update section is now embedded within the LCAP and is no longer a separate document. And as I have shared in the previous slides, there are the new Learning Recovery Emergency Block Grant requirements. We just want to give you a reminder, which I'm sure all of you know, about the mid-year report requirement. And again, the LEA must present a report on the annual update to the LCAP on or before the February 28th of each year at a regularly scheduled meeting of the governing board of the LEA. And at this meeting, you will be sharing all available mid-year outcome data of the metrics in the LCAP, mid-year implementation data of the LCAP actions, and all available mid-year expenditure data in the LCAP. As I shared at the beginning of today's presentation, today's outcome is to help you reflect on the effectiveness of year one. It is imperative to reflect on these questions when you engage with your educational partners. How will you reflect on effectiveness in year one? What will you roll over? What didn't you roll over or won't you be rolling over? And what are the implications for year 2 in each section of the LCAP? So we ask you today, as you're listening to all of the presentations, at the end of today and the end of Thursday, how are you going to approach year 2 in the 25-26 LCAP? Because our presentation will be taking this approach, we do refer you to CDE's training webinars if you need more detailed information on the LCAP and the instructions. The link at the bottom of the slide outlined in orange is the CDE LCAP webpage where you will find many resources. Additionally, we have posted the LCAP presentations from the Tuesday at 2 webinar series on our Canvas webpage. And you can find the presentations on the LACO link on the slide that's outlined in blue. And so with that, let's get started. And now Laurel will share on the plan summary.
Thank you, Adrienne. Now we're going to go over the plan summary section for the 2025-26 LCAP template. The plan summary is where LEAs share context for their LCAP for the upcoming school year. This context provides general information about the LEA's community and includes specific information about student needs and their performance in the state priority areas. This information connects to performance of all students and student groups, as well as highlighting any disparity of outcomes. The response in this section intentionally provides a meaningful connection to the content included in other sections of the LCAP. We will take a look at each of the prompts included in the plan summary and, as with all of the LCAP template sections, direct your attention to what is included in the instructions in order to support an understanding of what must be included in each response. We will also highlight what is new in this year's plan summary. As Adrienne mentioned, we will provide guidance for organizing and implementing a year 2 approach to developing this year's plan summary. In the general information section, LEAs describe information about the LEA, its schools, and its students. This information will support the educational partners and readers to understand what is being addressed in the plan. LEAs determine what information to include in order to address each of the 3 areas. The instructions include a frame for providing information about the LEA in terms of geography, enrollment, employment, as well as the number and size of specific schools and recent community challenges. As a new addition this year, LEAs may also provide information about their strategic plan and vision. As a reminder, LEAs must identify their school or schools that are eligible for equity multiplier funding. CDE is scheduled to post a list of schools in February 2025. You will see the connection to these eligible schools specifically addressed in the Engaging Educational Partners section and the Goals and Action section of the template. The annual performance section requires LEAs to reflect on their annual performance on the dashboard and using local data. This reflection includes the performance of the LEA, student groups, and school-level performance. This may include areas where the LEA identified successes as well as challenges in looking at their dashboard data and local data sources during the development of the LCAP. In this section, LEAs are encouraged to highlight how they are addressing identified needs of student groups and schools in the LCAP as part of this response. We will be covering additional requirements for this section in upcoming slides. The performance ratings from the 2023 dashboard, where the LEA received the lowest performance level that were reported in last year's LCAP, must remain unchanged in the 2025-26 LCAP. The response identifies schools, student groups, and student groups within a school that receive the lowest performance level of red, with one or more state indicators on the dashboard. Reporting on the lowest performance levels from the 2023 dashboard must remain unchanged during the 3-year cycle. In this way, LEAs will annually reflect on performance to show where outcomes are improving for these schools, student groups, and LEA level performance. New this year, Ed Code requires information regarding Learning Recovery Education Block Grant, or LREBG, funds in the Reflections on Annual Performance section. LEAs must first identify whether or not they will have unexpended LREBG funds in the 2025-26 school year. This requirement will continue through the 2027-28 school year's LCAP. LEAs with unexpended funds must also include one or more actions funded with LREBG along with additional information. If the LEA identifies that they will have unexpended LREBG funds, they must provide the goal and action number for each action that is either partially or fully funded out of LREBG funds. They must also provide the rationale for selecting each action and include an explanation of how the action is aligned with the allowable uses of funds identified in Ed Code and how the action is expected to address the student and school needs identified in the required needs assessment. As Adrian mentioned earlier, be aware that LEAs might receive additional LREBG funds for the 2025-26 school year. We are awaiting further guidance on whether that will impact your LCAP. LEAs that have requested technical assistance or received it as a result of differentiated assistance eligibility need to provide the reason for technical assistance, including DA eligibility and a description of the support. LEAs that are neither eligible for nor receiving technical assistance may respond to this prompt as not applicable. Once the LEA has identified the reason for differentiated assistance, provide a summary of the work underway as part of receiving technical assistance. This chart clarifies how LEAs should respond in this section based on various DA scenarios. As a reminder, schools identified as eligible for DA receive DA support in 2-year cycles. The first column of this chart pertains to districts newly identified for DA. Next, we have LEAs that were eligible based on the 2023 dashboard and continue to be eligible for the same student group and eligibility area based on the 2024 dashboard. The third column explains the situation for districts that continue to be in DA, but based on the 2024 dashboard, additional student groups and/or new eligibility areas are added. For these LEAs, the 2-year DA support cycle begins even if the LEA was eligible for DA support the prior year. Finally, the last column addresses LEAs that were eligible for DA support based on the 2023 dashboard, but are not eligible for DA support based on the 2024 dashboard. As a reminder, DA support is provided in 2-year cycles, so after stating that the LEA does not have new or continued eligibility for DA, provide a summary of the work underway as part of receiving technical assistance in the 2-year cycle. In subsequent slides, we will provide guidance on actions that LEAs, which are eligible for DA and receiving technical assistance, are required to include in their LCAP. The last section addresses the requirement for schools that were eligible for comprehensive support and improvement in 2023 and continue to be eligible. The spreadsheet that includes both ESSA assistance eligibility in 23 and 24 and exit status is attached to this slide for your convenience. The response to the first prompt identifies the eligible schools based on the dashboard data from 2023. The second prompt addresses how the LEA supports the schools that continue to be identified in developing and implementing CSI plans. The response requires a description of how the LEA bases its supports for the eligible schools on the school level needs assessment, evidence-based interventions, and that support is based on identified resource inequities. The final prompt in this section addresses how the LEA supports the CSI school or schools to monitor and evaluate the implementation and effectiveness of the CSI plan to support student groups and school-level improvement. This slide contains several links to support the work of creating, evaluating, and monitoring CSI plans. So, what are the implications for this Year 2 LCAP? It's important during your process to carefully review the plan summary to evaluate whether you are providing a clear picture of the context for the LCAP. In addition, consider what information about strategic planning, vision, etc. might enrich the context you provide in your plan summary. There are 4 additional questions in this slide related to important elements of your Year 2 plan summary that we have covered, including equity multiplier funding, the 2023 dashboard, LREBG requirements, DA eligibility, and schools that continue to be eligible for CSI. Now I'll pass it on to Debbie, who will provide information on engaging educational partners.
Thank you, Laurel. So we're moving forward with the Engaging Educational Partners section. And for those of you who are newer to our LCAP world, we just want you to understand that we, as the state, switched to using educational partners instead of the term stakeholders, because we learned that this term was stakeholders could be considered offensive to some Native American groups, and therefore the state made a decision to move to the term educational partners instead. And really the idea of partnership is nice, and it captures the intent of this engagement. Next slide, please. So last year, we started using this new template with this format with tables. So this is relatively new for everyone, since most of us have only used this. We've all just used this once. And if you're new to the LCAP, you're not too far behind. And this table, it's going to require you to identify specific educational partners and the first prompt, and it's going to ask you to provide a summary of how they were engaged in the LCAP development process. So you can group 2 different partners if you want. If you wanted to say teachers and principals, you could put both of those groups there if they were engaged in the same process and the same timeline. So you can do that. You don't have to list them separately. But a sufficient response to this prompt must include the general information about the timeline of the process and the meetings and other engagement strategies that were used with those educational partners. And if an LEA is receiving equity multiplier funds, you must also include a summary of how they were consulted, the educational partners at that school, and how they were specifically given input to the development and the required focus goal for each of those schools. So the second prompt requires a description of how the feedback from the required educational partners influenced the development of any goals, metrics, actions, and/or budgeted expenditures. And a sufficient response to this prompt will provide educational partners and the public with a clear understanding and a specific information about how the engagement and process influenced the development of the LCAP. For example, this may include a description of how the LEA prioritized requests of educational partners within the context of the budgetary resources available or otherwise prioritize areas of focus within the LCAP. And again, an LEA receiving equity multiplier funds must include a description of how the consultation with the educational partners at the schools generating those funds influence the development of the adopted LCAP. Next slide, please. So the engagement of educational partners is an ongoing and continuous process. This section of our plan is designed to reflect on how the engagement with educational partners influenced the decision and reflected in the adoption of the LCAP. Your system should be set up to provide significant and purposeful engagement opportunities for parents, students, educators, and other educational partners, including those representing the student groups identified by LCFF. This engagement is critical to the development of the LCAP and the budget process because they possess valuable perspectives and insights. This section is designed to reflect how engagement with the ed partners influenced the decisions in the adopted LCAP. So keep in mind, as you work with your educational partners this year, that the engagement process you have in place should provide the feedback needed in order to show how the feedback influenced the decisions reflected in your LCAP. Next slide. The Engaging Educational Partners section does have specific requirements for school districts, county offices of education, and charter schools. They must, at a minimum, consult with teachers, principals, administrators, other school personnel, local bargaining units, that's for districts and county offices, parents, and students in this development of the LCAP. And for any LEA receiving equity multiplier funds, there must also be consultation with the educational partners at the school generating the equity multiplier funds. And that does include parents and those staff at that site. So next slide, please. Additionally required is that before adopting your LCAP, you must share it with the applicable committees, which are your Parent Advisory Committee and your English Learner Parent Advisory Committee, which for many LEAs is your DLAC. The superintendent is required to respond in writing to the comments received from those two committees. You must also, before finalizing and adopting your plan, consult with your special education local plan area administrator, also known as your SELPA. And the superintendent of the school district should notify members of the public with opportunities to write written comments regarding the actions and expenditures in the plan. Next slide, please. So in the second year of this 3-year plan, we wanted to leave you with some reminders and reflection. We think that much of this is the same, but we wanted to leave you these thoughts, and we wanted reminders that the student requirement is effective this year. So that is a must. Wanted you to consider, how are your educational partners contributing to your goal analysis process? Consider, if you have equity multiplier schools that have dropped off, how do you communicate with those folks? Or if you have new equity multiplier schools, how are you going to engage those folks? And then you want to consider how you have new members to a parent advisory committee. If they're new to this role, how will they understand the role of educational partners and the purpose of the LCAP? It's kind of a lot. So how do you make sure that they understand and to give them the opportunity to properly engage? And just as a reminder, this is a year 2. So many times we have some established systems. So if you follow the similar systems from last year, cut and paste is fine, but we just want to make sure that you remember to check your dates and make sure that they match the current year. And lastly, next slide. This is a link here to some really great resources that the CDE provides to help you engage your educational partners and to really reflect on your system of engagement and how you make your LCAP available and understandable to your partners. And now Helen and Augustine are going to take us to goals and actions.
Thank you, Debbie. Good morning, everyone. So in this section, we will cover the goals and actions and its implications for year 2. So developing the LCAP, as Adrian mentioned, is a process of continuous improvement that aligns with the state's effort to reduce redundancies at the local level. So the templates for LCAP and School Plan for Student Achievement, SIPSA, are designed to work together, empowering the LEAs and their educational partners with greater control and decision-making authority. So in this context, we will focus on the goals, measuring and reporting results, the embedded goal analysis within the template, and the required actions. First, let's take a look at the goal itself. This is a quick review of the LCAP instructions, which identify 4 types of goals that must be explicitly specified in this year's template. The focus goal is a targeted data-intensive goal designed to address specific needs and specific student groups. The broad goal is less concentrated in scope and may focus on improving performance across a wide range of metrics. And similarly, maintenance of progress goal focuses on sustaining and building upon existing progress. This goal allows an LEA to track performance of any metrics that may not be addressed in other goals of the LCAP. And new last year, remember that for LEAs with schools receiving equity multiplier funds, will need to still include an equity multiplier focus goal in their plans. We will have more on equity multiplier funds during the day 2 of our training. The why statement explains the rationale behind the goal, but its content will vary depending on the type of goal being written. For a focus goal, the why statement should explain why the LEA has prioritized this goal and how it was identified for focused attention using data from the California dashboard, local data, and input from the educational partners. For a broad goal, the why statement should explain the reason for the goal and how the actions and the metrics grouped together will help achieve it. And for maintenance of progress goal, the why statement should outline how the action will sustain the progress demonstrated by the associated metrics. We understand that many platforms, whether you use DTS or the eLCAP, it will roll over the goals from the previous LCAP. However, it's important to reflect on the goals to ensure it remains relevant and that the data still aligns with the needs that the goal and the actions aims to address. So what does this mean? Many of you have already started to engage with your educational partners. And it's important during this process to carefully review each goal to decide, whether the LEA will maintain, revise, or expand it. And be sure to consider feedback from ed partners and analyze data to inform these decisions. So here's an example goal and the why statement from the 2024-25 LCAP. And yes, this will roll over, but consider this. So I know you don't know this goal extensively, but take a look at the part in red. As you can see, the reflection from educational partner feedback and the most recent data highlights the need to continue this goal. While this reflective piece is not explicitly required in the instructions, it is an important process to follow. This ensures that the LCAP is not just a compliance document, but a purposeful plan that truly addresses the needs for the 25-26 school year. And now Augustine will continue onto the metrics.
And as we progress through the arrow on our slide, let's move on to the measuring and reporting results subsection of this LCAP template. Let's go ahead and get started by talking about the difference between metrics and actions. So a metric indicates the unit of measurement for an expected outcome, whereas an action is something that's done to cause the expected outcome. So for example, your metric could be suspension rate, identified as a percentage. Your expected outcome can be that you plan to reduce suspensions by 5%. So your action might be staff training in PBIS. So just remember, measuring is not an action, and an action is not an outcome. So shifting our attention over to that red text box there, there's a requirement in the LCAP to address the LCFF state priorities And it states that at a minimum, the LCAP must address all LCFF priorities and the associated metrics articulated in Ed Code sections 52060D and 52066D as applicable to the LEA. So the LCFF state priority summary linked on this slide provides a summary of both Ed codes to aid in the development of your LCAP. And as we enter the second year of this LCAP cycle, the metrics table will need to be updated. So your task will be to complete the year one outcome and the current difference from baseline columns. The only column that should remain blank is the year two outcome. If you need to revise your baseline or your target for year three, just remember to identify the change as part of the response to prompt 4 of your goal analysis. So how will the metrics table look? So as you can see here, the metric and the baseline will remain consistent. And the year three target will likely remain unchanged for most, if not all, your metrics. What needs to be clearly articulated is the most recent data and the difference between that year one outcome and the baseline data. So per the LCAP instructions, there are 3 required metrics that must be included in your plan. So there are required metrics for LEA-wide contributing actions. There are required metrics for equity multiplier goals. And new this year are the required metrics for actions supported by unexpended LRE-BG funds. Let's take a closer look at this new requirement. So to implement the requirements of Ed Code section 52064.4, LEAs with unexpended LRE-BG funds must include at least one metric to monitor the impact of each action funded with LRE-BG funds. So the metrics being used to monitor the impact of each action funded with LRE-BG funds are not required to be new. They may be metrics that are already being used to measure progress towards goals and actions already included in your LCAP. So key considerations and implications for year two are that metrics support the LEA in identifying progress towards the stated goals, measuring the impact of the actions within the goals, and determining the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of the actions within the goals. A quick plug on day 2, our colleagues from Accountability and Data Literacy will share a helpful tool that identifies the metrics to be included in the LCAP along with local indicators. Back to you, Helen.
So as we continue through the arrow on our slide, we now move to the goal analysis subsection of the LCAP template. So one of the biggest changes from the 2024-25 LCAP to year 2 of the LCAP is that there's no longer a standalone annual update template. Instead, the goal analysis is embedded within the template. And keep in mind that your goal analysis prompt 1, 2, and 3 focuses on the 2024-25 school year, and prompt 4 addresses the changes made based on the needs for the 25-26 school year. The instructions for the goal analysis have not changed, but there are important implications for year 2. The questions here correspond to the prompts in the goal analysis and help evaluate the progress of the goals. These prompts include: how will the implementation be monitored, and what tools or processes will be used to determine if the actions were implemented as planned? Who's responsible for tracking funding, and how will you assess the reason for any material differences? What specific data and metrics will be reviewed to evaluate the effectiveness of the actions? And lastly, how will changes be documented in the LCAP to ensure transparency and alignment with the goals? So what will this look like? Take a moment to look at this prompt. Here we have an example goal analysis prompt for prompt 1. And prompt 1 asks to describe the overall implementation and relevant successes and challenges regarding the implementation, as well as any substantive differences in the planned action and the actual implementation of the plan. So this example response groups 2 actions and discusses the level of implementation as well as the successes and challenges encountered. This helps provide a clear assessment of how the actions were carried out and gives valuable insight into areas of how it was actually implemented. So as you can see, it includes the key components for prompt 1 that are called out: the level of implementation, successes, challenges, and what was substantively different from the original plan. Remember, that the challenges and successes and substantive differences are all part of the overall implementation of the goal. So in this case, the actions were fully implemented, but the challenge was a shortage of substitute teachers, which required the PLCs to be held after school instead of during the day as initially planned. This highlights how the analysis reflects both successes and the adjustments made when things differ from what was planned. To support you in writing your goal analysis for prompt 1, you can see that this frame includes the components required by the LCAP instructions when responding to this prompt. Please note that there is no one right way to write this prompt, as long as all required prompt components are addressed. And remember to address all actions for their implementation. Now, let's take a look at an example goal analysis response for prompt 3. Prompt 3 asks to describe the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of specific actions in making progress towards the goal. Again, let me remind you, this is not an exemplar, as each district is unique with its own needs and circumstances. And keep in mind that this is just one action we're using to break apart and show what is required in the instructions. The goal is to demonstrate how to address the key components, and your response will be specific to your district's context and data. So, as you can see, this example includes all the components for prompt 3 that are called out, the degree of effectiveness, and the evidence supporting that statement of effectiveness are clearly outlined. This demonstrates how to evaluate the impact of actions taken and provides the necessary data to justify the conclusion about their effectiveness. So, to support you in writing your goal analysis for prompt 3, you can see that this frame also includes the components. Components in the required by the instructions. And your additional evidence can also come from educational partner feedback. So, as a reminder, all actions must be addressed for their effectiveness or ineffectiveness. So when assessing the effectiveness of LEA-wide or school-wide actions that contribute to the requirement to increase or improve services, remember that LEAs must use the metrics associated with the LEA-wide or school-wide actions that you identified in the increased or improved section. And also, consider other additional local data that may present a better insight to evaluate the effectiveness or the ineffectiveness of the action for the 24-25 school year. And now for our last subsection, we will review the required actions.
All right, let's continue our journey through this arrow on our slide. And like Helen said, we're going to move to the actions subsection of the LCAP template.
I'm so sorry. I apologize.
It's okay.
Okay.
All right, one more.
Sorry about that.
There we go, right on track. So the next few slides are going to highlight the existing and new requirements for LEAs to include specific actions in the LCAP. So there are required actions for English learners and long-term English learners, as well as for districts that receive technical assistance, commonly referred to as differentiated assistance. And there are also required actions for the lowest performing indicators on the 2023 dashboard. And new this year, there are required actions for unexpended LRE-BG funds. So let's take a look at each one of these.
And so, okay.
Here we go. Let's start with our required actions for ELs and LTELs. So like it was mentioned before, with school-wide data now available for LTELs and your mid-year update approaching next month, this is an excellent time to engage your ed partners in analyzing the current LCAP actions and gathering feedback for year 2. So as the focus question on this slide highlights, how do your actions address the identified needs and ed partner feedback for year 2? Remember that if an LEA has 30 or more English learners and or 15 or more long-term English learners, it must include specific actions addressing each group. These actions must target language acquisition programs for students and professional development for teachers. So in essence, there could be 4 distinct actions to meet this requirement. All right, let's dig into this example. Action 2.1 is designed to meet the needs of LTEL students by 1, providing professional development for teachers and paraprofessionals, and it's delivered by the district EL specialist and math specialist. And 2, utilizing paraprofessionals to deliver small group instruction focused on reinforcing academic vocabulary, supporting language acquisition for these LTELs. In this action, we see a clear application of that core principle that we emphasize when crafting actions. Who is doing what for whom, and to what extent. Another requirement applies to LEAs eligible for technical assistance, commonly referred to as differentiated assistance or DA. So these LEAs must include specific actions within their LCAP that align to the work being implemented as part of the technical assistance or DA process. As mentioned earlier in the presentation by Laurel, LEAs are also expected to address this ongoing work in the plan summary section. So last year, your LEA developed actions targeting the lowest performing student groups and or schools as identified by the 2023 California School Dashboard. This is a reminder that these actions must remain in place throughout the 3-year LCAP cycle. If any minor modifications or revisions are necessary, please ensure that they are clearly documented in prompt 4 of the goal analysis section for the relevant goal. All right, and new this year is the requirement for districts to include actions funded with unexpended LREBG funds. For each action supported by LREBG funding, the action description must include the following. So clearly identify the action as an LREBG funded action, provide an explanation of how research supports the selected action, specify the metric or metrics being used to monitor the action's impact, and then clearly state the amount of LREBG funds allocated to support the action. Here's a sample. So it's action 2.7. Future Ready Counseling has been added as an LREBG action with the requirements discussed on the previous slide called out right there in the action description. Let's take a closer look. So as you can see, the action is clearly identified as an LREBG action. There's an explanation of how research supports this action. A metric has also been identified to monitor the impact of the action. And finally, the amount of LREBG funds being used to support the action are also clearly identified. So this action, as you can see in the 5th column, is a contributing action for unduplicated pupils. The total amount of funds for this action is $450,000, $35,560 of which are LREBG. Those $35,560 will not count towards meeting your minimum proportionality percentage because LREBG funding is not LCFF. There'll be more on MPP in the sections that come and also on day 2. So for the actions portion, the key considerations and implications for year 2 are the following. You've got to evaluate your actions, review the effectiveness of your current actions to ensure alignment with the goals, reassess the funding, analyze the funds allocated to each action, and determine if adjustments are needed, such as increasing or reducing funding based on effectiveness. Continue to engage your ed partners, gather feedback to inform those decisions, and decide your next steps. Determine whether each action should be adopted or adapted. So considering all those implications that we talked about in this section, how are the changes documented from year 1 to year 2? And what does this look like? All right, so let's take a look at 2 actions from a 24-25 LCAP. So extended summer school program and PD and coaching to support ELD were crafted last year for implementation during this current 24-25 school year. Both actions are contributing to the increased or improved services for unduplicated students. The same 2 actions will carry over to the 25-26 LCAP with revisions informed by data analysis and input from ed partners. Notably, an after-school program component has been added for Action 2.5, and for Action 2.6, PD is now offered to teachers delivering integrated ELD instruction. So for our LREBG action requirement sample, let's revisit Action 2.7 that we shared earlier. This new action was aligned to one of the allowable uses under Ed Code Section 32526C, and also based on the needs assessment performed by the district. So all of the changes indicated in the actions must be identified as part of the response in prompt 4 of the goal analysis. Here we see the components that were added to actions 2.5 and 2.6, and we can also see that action 2.7 was added to the goal as an LREBG action. So in this second year, your goals, actions, and metrics will most likely roll over. But how would you know if they're still relevant and applicable for this coming year? reflecting on your outcomes and continuing to engage your ed partners is all the more vital this year.
So as we conclude this sections of goals and actions in year 2, please consider the following questions. What are the implications for year 2? How do our descriptions and expenditures reflect our local planning process? What rolls over? What didn't roll over? What will we keep? What will we modify? How do the descriptions reflect the feedback from the educational partners? How do the descriptions connect to the data reported in the measuring and reporting results section and local data? How do the descriptions reflect any changes made to the action for year 2? And now, finally, quiz time, everyone. So which of the following year 2 changes do you need to address the goal and the goal analysis prompt for? A, goal description, B, expected outcomes, C, metrics, D, actions, or E, all of the above? Place your answers in the chat. A, B, C, or D. All right. So yes, many of you guys got it. A is correct. And please note that all our samples that we shared are on our Canvas page for your convenience. The link is included on this slide. And now to Jeannie for increased or improved services.
There we go. All right. So we're going to begin with an overview of the components included in the increased or improved services section. So here in this screenshot, you see snippets from this section. And in the top box on the left, LEAs include the fiscal summary for their LCFF supplemental and or concentration grant funding that the LEA estimates it will receive for the coming year. And this funding is based on the LEA's number and concentration of foster youth, English learners, and low-income students. And these amounts align to projections in the May revise. At the top is the total projected LCFF supplemental and concentration grant amount for the coming year. This amount includes the additional 15% concentration grant for LEAs with greater than 55% unduplicated pupil count. Then in the second box, the additional 15% concentration grant amount is identified separately. The second row then reflects the projected percentage to increase or improve services for the coming year as compared to services provided for all students. This reflects the proportional increase in funding received for the coming year as compared to the LCFF base grant. The carryover boxes reflect the percentage and dollar amount of any LCFF carryover that is calculated from the current year estimates for costs included in the Contributing Actions Annual Update table and the calculations in the carryover table. These percentages are added together to determine the total percentage by which services for English learners, low income, and foster youth must be increased or improved in the coming LCAP year. There are 3 prompts that follow this fiscal information. The first prompt provides descriptions for contributing actions included in the goals and actions section that are provided LEA-wide or school-wide. The second set of descriptions connects to limited actions that are only provided to English learners, low income, and or foster youth. And lastly, are descriptions about how the LEA is using additional concentration grant funding to increase staff providing direct services to students at schools with an enrollment of unduplicated students that's greater than 55%. We should be going to the next slide. I'm getting a message on my computer that's asking me to refresh. All right, so I'm going to hit that refresh button and go down to our slide. All right, so What you're looking at on the next slide while I get there is the purpose statement from the instructions included in the LCAP template. And what this is talking about is that this section really provides a dedicated description about how the LEA plans to increase or improve services for the coming year. And this section connects to the LEA's contributing actions, and it should make it clear for educational partners how the LEA is increasing or improving services for their English learners, low income, and foster youth in proportion to the increase in funding the LEA receives to address the unique needs and circumstances facing these student groups. The descriptions in this section must reflect the intentionality for addressing equity of outcomes for the 3 student groups that generated an increase in funding. Okay. You'll also note on the slide are the specific sections from the LCAP template from which the information that is provided in this section is derived. Next slide, please. All right, so we're going to take a closer look at each of these prompts, and really our intent is to get to that lens of how do we approach these descriptions in year 2 in the LCAP process. So in the first prompt here, we're just going to provide an overview of what's required. So let's unpack these descriptions. And this first section is addressing actions that are LEA-wide or school-wide. So outlined in gold, the LEAs provide an explanation of the unique needs of the LEA's unduplicated student group for whom the action is principally directed. And an LEA demonstrates how an action is principally directed toward an unduplicated student group or groups when they explain the needs, conditions, or circumstances of that group that they have identified through a needs assessment. And the instructions make it clear that a meaningful needs assessment includes both analysis of applicable student achievement data and educational partner feedback. Then in the middle column, outlined in blue, LEAs provide an explanation of how the action as designed will address the unique needs they described in the first column about the student group for whom the action is principally directed. In addition, the LEA must provide the rationale for why they're providing the action LEA-wide or school-wide. All right, so let's get into our first example. So here's an LEA-wide example that connects to 2 actions that are contributing to the requirement to increase or improve services. These 2 actions are Action 5, Reading Specialists, and Action 6, After School Literacy and Arts. Okay, you can see from the description that in the first column for identified needs, the response indicates the student groups to whom the action is principally directed. It explains the unique needs, conditions, and circumstances, in this case, considered for the low-income students. And you can see there's dashboard data for the low-income students, as well as feedback from educational partners. Okay. In the second column, the response explains what is planned to address the feedback from educational partners and that data that was considered for the low-income students. And additionally, the response indicates why the action is provided to all students. In the final column, you can see the metrics that the LEA is going to use to monitor the effectiveness or the progress being made towards the target outcomes. And so you can see multiple data points included, and included in green is the the CASP language arts assessment that's included in Goal 1, Metric 2, and Metric 3. This is called out for you because last year was the first year that LEAs were required to include a metric in the measuring and reporting results table for their LEA-wide or school-wide actions. Okay, so this was an action in the LCAP last year. So let's take a look at what we might consider as we're continuing what to do with this action moving forward or any other of our contributing actions. So as Helen offered in her presentation with Augustine about questions to consider about actions in year 2, similar questions are offered for your consideration about how to consider approaching year 2. So what are the implications for year 2? How do the descriptions and expenditures reflect your local planning process for contributing actions? What rolls over? What doesn't roll over? What are we going to keep from these descriptions? What are we going to change? How are we including how we reflected this year on needs, conditions, and circumstances of English learners, low income, and foster youth? And how do our descriptions connect to data that we might have included in the measuring and reporting results section? And then finally, if we make changes to the action, are those included in our descriptions in this increased or improved services section? So those are questions for your consideration as you're approaching year 2. So let's go on to the next slide. And we're going to look at this same action in year 2. And we're thinking of the year 2 consideration. Okay, and so here you can see this is the same description as that we were looking at before, but you can see highlighted in pink and then identified in the call out section that additional dashboard and program evaluation data has been added to describe how the LEA considered unique needs, conditions, and circumstances of their low-income students. And so you can see the updated dashboard data, and you can see the program evaluation that was provided and how that indicated a unique need that the LEA considered. Then in the middle column, you see those 2 components. First, how the action is addressing these needs, and second, why you're providing it on an LEA-wide basis. This response might still apply. You might still be considering and including this action in the same manner. And then in this example, the metrics may still apply. So in this case, they do, so they're not changed from the description in the current LCAP. So let's go on now to a school-wide example. And we have a description of a school-wide example that's being provided at a specific set of schools. And so in the identified needs section, you see the response indicates the student group to whom the action is principally directed. And in this action, the LEA considered unique needs, conditions, and circumstances of low-income students at specific schools. And so here the description includes data from the dashboard and feedback from students and low-income parents. And then the second column explains how this action for after-school reading program is going to address the needs described. In the third column, you see the set of metrics the LEA will use to monitor progress at these schools. Let's go on to the next example. And so we're going to take this same school-wide example in year 2. Okay, we're going to look and see called out on our slide is that, the LEA considered updated data. So they really should include that in this description. And there's updated data based on local assessment and 2024 dashboard data. So this really informs what the LEA considered, and so should be added to this identified need. Okay. In the middle column, you see noted in that call out, it says the response still applies, and then it says and indicates additional schools. So in this case, a change that was made to this action was it was expanded to be provided at more schools. So that change is reflected in the description. And so what this is showing is this description aligns to the contributing action in the plan for the coming year. And then in this case, the metrics stayed the same. Okay, we'll jump to another action to provide an example or sample. And just like Helen said, none of these are exemplars. They're just samples for your consideration. What we're trying to do is really just call out the components that you need to be aware of as you are addressing these description requirements. Okay, so here's an example. You may have a new action. And so let's take a moment to look at this new action. This is a new action for addressing the needs of a specific student group. This is for the long-term English learners. And you can see the data included for long-term English learners at a particular grade span. And you can also see some educational partner input addressing the needs, conditions, circumstances facing the long-term English learners. This response indicates the student group is addressing long-term English learners, and it also is providing input from educational partners as well as dashboard data. Okay. Here, this new action is providing a district EL specialist and math specialist to provide professional development. And you can see additionally, additional paraprofessionals will support LTEL students. And you can read on to see the specifics of this action. Then you can also see that same why statement. And that why statement is included to indicate why the LEA is providing this on a school-wide basis. Okay? And then you can see in the metrics to monitor effectiveness where those metrics are included in the LCAP template and in the measuring and reporting results section, as well as some additional data points that the LEA has indicated they will use to monitor the effectiveness of this action. Okay, we're going to go now to the next prompt. And the next prompt is about limited actions. The requirements are fairly similar. However, these actions, remember, are being provided only to one of the unduplicated pupil groups. And in this case, the action is addressing the needs of foster youth. Okay? And this is a foster youth mentor program. You can see the dashboard data considered for this action, and you can see input from educational partners. In this case, a foster youth student advisory committee analyzed data and considered root causes about chronic absenteeism and suspension rates. And you can see information that they gathered from empathy interviews. Here you can see in the middle column how this action responds to what they considered from their data and input from the foster youth community. And so this response in the middle column then explains how the action is going to address the specific data and input that they received to address the needs of their foster youth students. And then in the metric column, you can see, or in the metrics column, you can see the metric is unique to foster youth. All right, let's look at this action on the next slide in year 2. Okay. And by now, you're probably getting a sense of the pattern. What updated data might you consider putting in your year 2 example? In this year 2 example, that was the limited action for foster youth. They've updated with dashboard data for foster youth. Okay, the middle column, that response is staying the same because they're continuing the action and they haven't made changes to it. And then the last column continues with that, those metrics to monitor the effectiveness of this action for the foster youth in this particular LEA. All right, so now we're going to jump to the limited actions. If you are using the planned percentage of increased or improved services, if you're using the percentage of hold on one second. The second prompt of the this section addresses any actions with the planned percentage of improved services. So for limited actions that might not have any funding, they don't have any funding, the action may have a percentage of improved services. And so for each action with an identified planned percentage of improved services, the LEA needs to identify the goal and action number and describe the methodology that was used to determine the percentage of improved services. And so the LEA, there's an example here of how to describe this methodology. And this is an example that we provided last year. And the methodology has to describe what the LEA used to determine the contribution of the action towards the proportional percentage. And the percentage of improved services for an action then would correspond to the amount of LCFF funding that the LEA estimates it would have used if it had to pay for the action. And so an example is provided here. And what we wanted to bring to your attention is if you're continuing one of these actions without any funding, you would need to update for year 2 the methodology that you're using so that it would reflect alignment to the amount budgeted for your action in the 25-26 LCAP. Right, next slide, please. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. I know we went through a lot of information, especially with all of the examples, but we really wanted to provide some considerations for you and some samples as you're moving toward developing your LCAP in year 2. So on behalf of the team, I thank you for joining us, and please reach out to us with any questions you may have. We're here to support you, and as always, we really appreciate your feedback. So please complete the evaluation for our workshop today, and have a great rest of your day. Take care.